Welcome to Nomad PHP Lightning Talks. I'm Joe Ferguson. Nomad PHP Lightning Talks are 10-minute talks that give a high-level overview or an in-depth look at a small portion of a PHP-related topic. Lightning Talks are a great way for new speakers to build their speaking resume and for long-time speakers to test drive a new talk idea. If you'd like to give a 10-minute lightning talk, please email me, joe@nomadphp.com. Right now we have Henning Glatter-Götz, and he will be talking to us about JSON-API. You can bring Sanity to your PHP APIs. Please make sure you visit JoinIn after the talk and leave Henning some feedback. Henning, I'm going to swap to you and take it away when you're ready.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about JSON API and how it can bring sanity to your APIs. And just to clarify, I am talking about JSON API, the specification, and not APIs that have a content type of JSON, or at least not only that. My name is Henning Glatter-Götz, and I'm a backend developer, a PHP backend developer, and I've been dabbling in Ember.js for a little while now, and that is basically the reason how or why I came to JSON API, because its data layer, Ember Data, uses JSON API. And it was developed by the guys that develop Ember.js, which is Yehuda Katz, and Steve Klabnik was also the one who collaborated on JSON API. In my spare time, I do a little bit of podcasting. I host a show called Reactive.audio, which is a panel discussion about current tech news with a focus on JavaScript, but since I'm a PHP developer, I try to get my 2 cents about PHP in there every now and then. And I also host a second show, or co-host a second show, that's called Descriptive.audio. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I'm really excited about one of the upcoming shows. Ed Finkler, whom I'm sure all of you guys know, has agreed to be on our show, and we are going to basically explore his programmer origin story, meaning how he got into programming, and going to talk to him about his progression up until today. And of course, we're going to talk about his open sourcing mental illness project. All right. Yeah, I'm sure your APIs are not actually insane, but this talk is sort of based on the last 6 years of me working as a backend developer, and a big portion of that work, of course, is integrating with APIs, either internal or external, and includes some of the sort of big name players out there. And by that I mean companies like Salesforce and ExactTarget and things like that. Another big part of that, of course, is building APIs for internal and external use. And after a certain time, you sort of ask yourself, what do all of these have in common? Even if they're all you know, more or less RESTful, and they all have a content type of JSON, the fact is that they're all quite different, actually. And by that I mean in the way that they format their body or their content, how they handle or how they use query parameters, etc. So why is this? The reason for this is basically REST is extremely flexible, and that's a great thing. And basically that's one of the reasons that we all came to REST, probably running from SOAP, maybe screaming sometimes. REST is very lightweight, it's easy to understand, quick to implement, and it doesn't dictate any kind of structure because it doesn't really make sense, since it allows multiple content types such as XML, JSON, CSV, etc. So all this is positive, so what's so bad about this? This basically means that since you have all this freedom and there's no standards, essentially every API provider has, you know, the option to implement things more or less the way they want. And as a result, every API really speaks sort of a different language, or a slightly different dialect maybe. And as an API consumer, you have to basically learn things over and over from one API to the other to understand the details about the individual API. So, and I'm not really just talking about how to serialize or deserialize a resource that's represented as a JSON object. What I'm talking about are the edge cases of you know, how the API really works and how its intricacies are, and that's what's going to eat up all of your time. And the other thing is that as a community, we can't really come around or gather around and build tooling to help us out because everything is so different. So we're essentially reinventing the wheel over and over, and spending a lot of time either sort of arguing or maybe thinking to ourselves about trivial implementation details. And in other words, that is bike shedding. So there are, JSON API is not the first standard to try to solve this problem. There are others out there, such as HAL and Siren and OData. But we're going to talk about JSON API here. So what is covered by this specification is essentially content negotiation, document structure, fetching data, creating, updating, and deleting resources, query parameters, and errors. We're going to talk about most of these here very, very briefly. So content negotiation basically means that both the server and the client need to have a header, a content type header with this value. And I'm going to show you a little bit about document structure just to give you a sense of what it looks like. So here's a simple example of a single resource. And basically, it requires that there is a top level or a root level key named data, and it either contains a single resource or an array of resources. And as in this type, it's a single resource. And the simplest version of a resource would contain these three properties, basically type, ID, and attributes, where type specifies basically the model name, or what type of resource this is. The ID obviously is the unique identifier, and the attributes is the list of the field names. A slightly more involved example would be pretty much the previous plus a relationship. So this article resource that we had before is here as well, and it is related to an author, or the other way around. There's an author associated with this article. And the way this is expressed is there is a second key underneath or in the resource itself that's called relationships, and it's named authors or author, and it has two properties, links and data. And where link, it basically provides two things, which is a link to itself, as well as a link to fetch this related resource, which is the author. And the second part of it is the data. And in this particular case, this data is a resource identifier object. So it's not the full resource because you don't see any attributes there. It just identifies the resource by type and ID. And if you had, for example, fetched this document with the option to include all relationships, then that particular author resource would be in the included key that you see at the very bottom, which is essentially an array of all the related resources. And this ensures that, or basically building the structure this way ensures that there's a very shallow hierarchy of the document. And by including all of these resources or the related resources, you can save yourself or you save your application a number of round trips to the server. So you don't have to go and fetch everything individually. All right, so an example of fetching data with a sparse field set would be something like this. Let's say we want to get a list of articles. And for the articles, we don't want all the available attributes. We only want the title and the body. The way that would be specified is with this fields query parameter, which is a reserved word. And in square brackets, you would specify the name of the resource that this applies to. So if you would request articles and its related objects, it might also include authors. So if you wanted a sparse field set also for the authors, you would do the same thing. Simply add another fields parameter and have authors in the square brackets. And fetching data, so here's the sorting. Sort is also something that is in the specification as a reserved word. And if you just want to sort ascending by, for example, created, the field created, this is how you would specify it. If you wanted to specify a descending sort order, you would just put a minus in front of the field name. If you had multiple fields you wanted to sort on, you just separate them by commas. The specification also deals with pagination and filtering, but we're not going to go into that now. The next thing we will look at is errors. So an error document would look something like this, and the only requirement per the specification is that it has a key, a top level or root level key called errors, and that is an array of error objects. It doesn't really say much about what the error objects should look like, but here's an example or a suggestion. For example, the status is the HTTP status code. The source is actually a JSON pointer that is pointing to the place in the request document that is causing this problem, and then you have some further explanations of what the error is about. So how does all of this help us really? And the answer to that is tooling, the things that I had mentioned before. And why is that? So tooling allows us, or the standard itself plus the tooling allows us to have repeatable results. And it allows us to focus on really only acquiring or learning the domain knowledge that is required to understand what the API is delivering to us or what kind of service it is providing to us. We don't have to now additionally learn the technical details and the intricacies of the API. How does it return collections? How does it return single resources? Or what are the query parameters, etc.? Or how do the query parameters work, for example, for sorting and for filtering and for pagination and all that stuff? So that all falls away, and there's really no longer a need to write custom client code, because all you have to do is, which we'll see in just a minute, basically specify your models and your schema, and then the client libraries can help you deal with the rest. So this is what I mean by bringing sanity to your APIs, is that you take away all the mundane, boring stuff and make things repeatable and less error prone. So what I'm talking about here is there are client libraries now that implement the JSON API standard. There's several libraries for each of these languages. The same thing goes for the server, and there's quite a few more there. What we are interested in, however, is the PHP server libraries, and there's actually quite a few as of today, and you can see that they're sort of in three categories, it seems like. They're either framework agnostic or deal with or support Symfony 2 or Laravel. What I'm going to look at, or what I picked out, is basically this one. It's Neomerc's JSON API, and the reason I chose this a few months ago is that it had pretty good activity on GitHub. It has quite a few contributors and very nice documentation. So up until now, maybe this is something what you would have been doing or have been doing, is that you get your results for a request to one of your endpoints. You would get your data out of your database with whatever you do that, either strict PDO or just with some kind of ORM, maybe doctrine or something. And then you would go about basically building an array representation of your document structure, and then maybe throw it into JSON encode and return that. However, with this library, you can instantiate an encoder, and as the first parameter, you would pass it an array that basically is a mapping of models to schemas. And what that means is, so your model is pretty much what it sounds like. It is the object that contains your data, and then the schema essentially describes how the data in this model is mapped to the JSON document. So there would be, for example, the schema would contain the type of the resource. In this case, it would be articles. It would also contain the base URL, or the URL where this resource can be fetched. It would specify which field in the model shall be used as the ID field, and then it will have an enumeration of all the attributes for that particular resource. And you can have any number of models in this list. The second parameter is basically an instance of encoder options, where you can specify various options for formatting, as well as the base URL for your API. And then you would basically take an array of articles that, or an array of article models, and pass that into the encoder. And if you had, if the articles contained relationships to authors, they would be basically nested inside of them. So that's why you wouldn't pass a separate array of author models, excuse me, into the decoder or encoder. And this would then essentially build the entire document for you with all the relationships, everything that's included, all the links, and you don't have to worry about that. And obviously that goes for the inverse as well. You don't just have an encoder, you have a decoder. So that brings me to the end of my really, really short introduction to JSON API. I hope you can take away something from that and start standardizing your APIs. Thank you.
All right, thanks for joining us for another Nomad PHP Lightning Talk. If you'd like to give a Lightning Talk, please email joe@nomadphp.com. Please make sure you visit Joined In and leave Henning some feedback.